Dr. Ross Moore first encountered Tibetan Buddhism at the Chisha Center in Australia in 1983. In 84, you became spiritual program coordinator at Tara Institute in Melbourne. You're still closely connected to it, the Tara Institute. You're currently helping Geshe Doga in bringing his teachings into publication. You're assisting in painting the artwork on the Great Enlightenment Stupa in Bendigo. This course is engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds. It's being offered on a supplementary basis for those who wish to take it. To finish the remainder of the text, test has already been given. New students who are interested can learn more about Shantideva's Bodhisattvacharyavatara. If you want to receive the materials, I'm going to put a link in the chat box, but it's also on the calendar under any one of the classes. If you click on the class, the form will be there, but I'll put the link in the chat box anyway. And 21 classes every Thursday until July 25th. And that's it. And did you want me to begin the prayers? Okay.
Thank you.
Opening prayers, taking refuge in generating bodhicitta. I go for refuge in the enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create to listening to the Dhamma, may I become a Buddha, in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create to listening to the Dhamma, may I become a Buddha, in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create to listening to the Dhamma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. By this merit may we attain omniscience and overcome our enemy, our harmful deeds. May beings buffeted by the waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death be liberated from the ocean of existence. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on Master Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in a concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, to the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara. How should any son of the lineage trained wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth since it's not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayeto Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhisoha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed how they praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. Praise to Manjushri. Homage to my Guru and protector Manjushri, who holds to his heart a scriptural text, symbolic of seeing all things as they are, whose understanding shines forth as the sun, unclouded by delusions or traces of ignorance, who teaches in 60 ways with the loving compassion of a father for his only son, all creatures caught in the prison of samsara, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. You whose dragon thunder-like proclamation of Dhamma arouses us from the stupor of our delusions and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, who wields the sword of wisdom, hewing down suffering wherever its sprouts appear, clearing away the darkness of all ignorance, you whose princely body is adorned with 112 marks of a Buddha, who has completed the 10 stages, achieving the highest perfections of a Bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning, I bow down to you, Manjushri, Om Rapatsanadi. With the brilliance of wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligent wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. By virtue of offering to you assembly of Buddhas, visualize before me this mandala built on a base resplendent with flowers, saffron water, and incense, adorns with Mount Meru and the 4 continents, as well as the sun and the moon. May all sentient beings share in its good effects. Please enjoy and bless me and all sentient beings to be released from the 3 poisonous minds, for I am offering without attachment my body, enemies, friends, and strangers, and all possessions which are the objects of my greed, ignorance, and hatred. O holy and venerable Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dhamma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Neyatayami. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious gurus.
Thank you. So it's a delightful opportunity here to return and continue. And I must admit, in preparing for the class, I found myself getting more and more deeply absorbed into several verses and realizing that the pace that I'd set myself is perhaps going to be a little bit slower than I had anticipated. So I had the opportunity yesterday of going to Melbourne to meet the Venerable Geshe Doga, my teacher, and consulted him on this. And he said the important thing is to look deeply into the essence of Shantideva's verses. And he said that the speed with which one presents them is not the point. It's gaining some feeling for this remarkable text and its meaning. So as I mentioned last year, His Holiness the Dalai Lama stresses that if we have one text beside our bed, beside our head, on our pillow, it should be this one. And we should spend some time every day considering at least one verse or even one line of one verse in order to enrich the way we conduct our day. So having said all that, I'm going to recommence from chapter 4, verse 13, which says, although for the benefit of every creature, countless Buddhas have passed by, yet I was not an object of their care because of my own mistakes. So generally speaking, this verse invokes a discussion of the veiling mechanisms, of the obscurations, and the manner in which our afflictions, our personal afflictions, operate to distort our view, our estimation of our own potential, our actual capacity. So this verse, therefore, seems a very ideal spot to jump straight back in to the commentary. As we tend to be very good at blocking our own potential, willfully or otherwise. So in the context of chapter 4, conscientiousness, verse 13, we continue the specific theme of the consequences of failing to guard our mind through the scrupulous and thorough application of attentiveness. If we lack this unwavering mental quality, then no matter how many showers of blessings the Buddhas rain down upon us, and of course they're doing this continuously in all directions for all sentient beings at all times, irrespective of their circumstances, nonetheless, if our mind is closed off, those blessings will pour off us as does water an upturned bucket. We'll be impervious, in other words, to the creative force of enlightened inspiration itself. We will not have a glimmer of this potential internally, nor will we see a glimmer of hope externally. Meaning, how can we recognize the quality of the Buddha and the Buddha's blessings if we're incapable of relating that to our own potential to following the Buddha's footsteps, holy footsteps, and become similarly enlightened? Not only that, but through the sheer force of our primordially ingrained habitual tendency to non-virtue, we find ourselves sliding inexorably towards increasingly sorrowful states. As the previous verse has said, I'm quoting Shantideva, therefore, just as I have promised, shall I respectfully accord my actions. If from now on I make no effort, I shall descend from lower to lower states. So we must remember here that Shantideva is concerned, deeply concerned, with the need for a person, a specific person, a person who has already adopted the awakening mind and hence has begun to act as an aspiring bodhisattva, to not in any way whatsoever injure or damage or jeopardize our fledgling bodhicitta mind, as it is the most precious mind. It is the most precious of all minds. It's the most extraordinary of all motivations. In other words, Shantideva here is addressing those of us who have placed at least a tentative toe on the path of the Bodhisattvas. So in verse 10, Shantideva has exemplified the unimaginable scope of the loss that would thereby be incurred, not just for oneself, but for all suffering mother sentient beings. It is nothing short of a forfeiture of the most precious promise we have made when we took our Bodhisattva vows. And you recall that this was the content of the third chapter. So the logic here, the pursuit of logic in Shantideva, is devastating. If we incur a certain amount of grievous non-virtue by destroying the joy of even one creature, perhaps by killing or harming them with sticks or bullets or words and so on, then we can calculate the karmic weight of withdrawing from the Bodhisattva promise to benefit all beings without exception. So you remember here that before Shantideva said that if we break our honourable trust to benefit one person, that's one thing, but how enormously greater is the breakage of our promise to benefit all sentient beings, which is the essence of our bodhicitta undertaking. So in verse 11, Shantideva declares the outcome unequivocally in terms of an incapacity to spiritually progress. And this is very, very important to bear in mind. Verse 11, thus, those who have the force of an awakening mind, as well as the force of falling from it, stay revolving within cyclic existence and for a long time are hindered in reaching the bodhisattva levels. So to paraphrase, if we fall from our promise of maintaining this awakening mind, we will become stultified, blocked, steeped in limited frames of mind, imprisoned by our own karmic blinkers, as it were, unable to work even for our own benefit, let alone the benefit of others. Of course, we can make this same observation more generally. Even if we haven't taken the Bodhisattva vows and thus haven't entered into this profound karmic contract, if you like, with all sentient beings, we will nonetheless feel or find ourselves trapped and blocked if we allow ourselves to continually exploit and harm others, all in the name of our personal needs and selfish satisfaction, our typical worldly attitudes, in other words. I think and I don't want to sort of digress, but it's hard not to mention the manner in which the world at the moment, as we know, is riven by the most extraordinary wars and the amount of pain that's accompanying those moments. So all this can be traced back to minds that are not considering the benefit of each and every sentient being with radiant, clear impartiality and concern. So all of this has a great bearing on how we interpret those times in our lives when we find ourselves incapable of engaging in unselfish, altruistic attitudes, or even attitudes of genuine self-care. We practice and practice and practice, but it seems that problems and difficulties keep befalling us. And it is as though our spiritual practice has come to naught. Now, I raise this because it's a common reason, inverted commas, it's not a real reason, but it's what's the word for it, a kind of rationalization that makes many people take that foot off the Bodhisattva path in its early stages, because they suddenly recognize and confront their own limit, their own estimation of their capacity to transform, and they despair and potentially give up. So at such potentially cataclysmic moments, we need to sensitively cast our minds back to the teachings on cause and effect, and to recognize that we are experiencing the outcome of our own past negative actions. So the momentum of those past negative actions is apparently thwarting our potential to generate virtue. Now, we must be very clear here that this, I use the word apparent, because they're not intrinsically capable of thwarting our path to enlightenment. They are adventitious restrictions or blockages. They are the product of cause and effect, and when those conditions are assembled, they can operate, and when those conditions aren't there, they cease. And so this is one of the proofs that His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives for our Buddha nature. He gives the example of anger. If anger was the essence of our mind, we would be continuously angry. And therefore, there'd be no scope whatsoever to even begin to think that we might separate our mind from the mind of anger. But this is not the case. So to bring us back to our topic, when it seems that our mind, despite our practice, is still being flooded with a negative mind such as anger, this isn't proof of the failure of our path. It's evidence of our own failure to act skillfully in the past. So there's a kind of karmic modesty required here to actually acknowledge that this is the problem. And it also is a very, very potent way of thinking, because it detoxifies, if you like, any idea that I am completely a mess or I'm a flawed person and a hopeless spiritual practitioner. This is just stuff that we're generating out of a despairing mind of ignorance, refusing to acknowledge the nature of things. So rather, I'm going to propose, than at this moment giving up, we should, with greater emphasis, turn our minds towards purifying our non-virtuous inclinations, and thus resolve to guard our actions of body, speech, and mind, so that henceforth we will only be an agent of benefiting others, not an agent of injury or harm. You can see here that we need to be able to extract ourselves from the fabric of our cultural existence, don't we, to actually adopt this stance, because we have nations compelling its members into these states of warfare and so forth at a massive scale of suffering. So if we can muster the power, the inner strength to do this, when all seems utterly futile or hopeless, this is the good part of the story, then it is certain that we'll be able to tackle all manner of obstacles, even when they appear unfairly flung at us, as though by a hidden cosmic adversary, some massive external force. In subtle karmic terms, such a seemingly insurmountable adversary is none other than an exteriorized projection of our own deluded, confused minds. So this is a point where we take the problem back, we own it, and we begin to unravel how it's got to be there and how it's got to be so powerful. And so Shantideva is going to repeat in many, many ways in this remarkable text how we have habituated ourselves to destructive actions so thoroughly over such vast periods of time that we seem to have an innate tendency to respond and act in this way. And thinking that this is innate and it's therefore can't be in any way thwarted or stopped is a complete misunderstanding of the meaning of observing the law of cause and effect. So in other words, as we find in the Lojong, the thought transformation teachings, when we do have these kinds of problems, even on a big scale, we are to recognize that they're the consequences of our own faults that have plagued us since beginningless time. So as the Venerable Pema Chodron says in her commentary, and I just, some of us will know this very beautiful commentary by the Venerable Pema Chodron on Shantideva. And she gives a brief verse-by-verse account. She says, on the one hand, through attentiveness to the way karma unfolds, we can act intelligently and use this precious human life as a path to enlightenment rather than a path to hell, to increase suffering in the lower realms. So, in other words, in our current situation, we find ourselves exquisitely pivoted at a potential crossroad. As Pema Chodron puts it, moment by moment, depending on the way we work with our minds, we either wake up or fall deeper and deeper into sleep. Sleep here, she's invoking as a kind of a catch-all for losing awareness and operative agency, any skillful operative agency. Thus, she continues, we either become more flexible and adventurous or more set in our ways. Therefore, may we act according to our promise. And so the promise here is the Bodhisattva promise. This is to be kept as the prime focus. In other words, the promise here is uniquely that of a Bodhisattva, to work for the benefit of each and every sentient being, irrespective of whether or not they have harmed or helped us. Even at a glance, we can appreciate that to fulfill this commitment requires a radical overhaul of our former self-occupied motives and equally self-serving tactics or actions. And conscientiousness, the subject of this chapter, is crucial, as it is when conscientiousness lapses that we lapse. So even at a glance, we can appreciate that to fulfill this commitment of overhauling our former self-occupied motives and self-cherishing attitude requires that we develop a very, very skillful and flexible conscientiousness, one that's able to accompany our mind and determine which way we're going, left or right, if you like. Speaking of the meaning of living or conducting ourselves in this meaningful way, this skillful way, His Holiness the Dalai Lama says with his customary pragmatism, I quote, "However, leading our life in a purposeful and meaningful way does not necessarily mean we have to lead a religious life in the sense of a religious belief or with religious faith. The key or essence is to lead life which is grounded in the principle of helping others, if possible. If not, at least refrain from harming others. So that is the key." End of quote. So this is the ethical foundation from which all of our virtuous actions spring. By way of contradistinction, His Holiness explains how the self-cherishing attitude operates. I quote, "If we think carefully, it seems that the more self-involved we are, the more self-absorbed we are, thinking, oh yes, me, my problem, my this and my that. It seems to have an immediate effect of narrowing our focus down to some tiny spot and reducing everything to that. It's almost as if our vision is blurred, even to the point of being burdened, being pressed down by some heavy load." So this in sort of picturing of a narrowed focus and emburdenment is precisely what Shantideva is describing when he says in verse 13, I quote again, "Although for the benefit of every creature, countless Buddhas have passed by, yet I was not an object of their care because of my own mistakes." So it's not that the Buddhas don't care, nor that they are not wishing to help us in each and every given moment, as I mentioned earlier. Rather, it is due to having become submerged in our own obscurations. We're in that proverbial frog in the proverbial well scenario. We know the story of the frog that died of shock when it was shown the great ocean. He couldn't believe that there was something greater than the water in the well, its home. It was so habituated to that narrow focus that it was overwhelmed and couldn't function when it saw something greater. So this is an analogy for the way in which the self-cherishing attitude has to keep circulating, regurgitating its own poisonous juices in order to continue to function in its destructive way. And it can't therefore see any other form of transformational nourishment beyond itself. So we are trapped by the narrow aperture of our self or our ego cherishing, unable to transact a world beyond the focus of our narrow concerns and viewpoint. I'm just going to give an example here of resentment. We know this is the case when we're filled with resentment towards a particular person. Even if a dear friend, our dear friend, is offering us consolation with an outstretched hand, we knock it away, even brutally, as though they are insulting us. But in this scenario, the real repulsive force is not our friend, whom we are currently, for whatever fabricated reason, resenting, but it's the rejective momentum of our own resentful mind. Under such aggravated circumstances, we'll not even hear our friends cry for help, let alone recognize their pain at having been so painfully rebuffed by us in this example. So again, unless we've done extensive transformative work, as Shantideva is advising, the only world that will appear to us is the one viewed through the restricted aperture of our self-cherishing, grounded in its own turn on self-grasping ignorance, which is a primordial misreading of reality, the actual status of the existence of things. So by way of contradistinction again, and swinging back the other way, His Holiness says, if we shift our focus from ourselves to others and think more about others' well-being and welfare, immediately it has a liberating effect. Because of that shift of focus, this is the liberating effect. His Holiness says it gives rise to some kind of strength, and it makes us feel more expansive. Even if we're facing problems and we are aware of our own problems, somehow that very shift in the focus provides the space. So the problem that seemed earlier before now seems to be much more manageable. It seems to be less significant than it was before. This is the truth. End of quote. So conscientiousness in this context means to continuously and ever so carefully maintain the thought, yes, I must really carry out the actions of a bodhisattva. I am 100% determined that I will accomplish such actions. Therefore, until the goal of enlightenment is reached, I shall continually exert effort precisely towards that end, not for my own sake, for I am only one, but for the sake of other mother sentient beings whose number are infinite. So as His Holiness says, quote, since the main teaching here, referring to Shantideva's text, is the generation of the mind for enlightenment, you should cultivate the right attitude, which is to put the focus on others, not on oneself, and spread it out, extending it to all sentient beings, if possible. For the benefit of all sentient beings, make a strong commitment that I will ensure that this altruistic mind never degenerates. So Shantideva is looking in these verses at the forces that might lead, unfortunately, to a degeneration of the altruistic mind, and he's providing us with tools to safeguard that altruistic mind, because there has never been a greater purpose held in the palm of our hand. So returning to the meaning of verse 13, although for the benefit of every creature, countless Buddhas have passed by, yet I was not an object of care because of my own mistakes. We're in a better position now, I think, having looked at this topic a little bit more widely, to appreciate Gyaltsabje's commentary on this verse, which is, innumerable Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who have worked for the benefit of all sentient beings have passed already, but due to my own fault of degenerating bodhicitta and the trainings, one did not become the object of their care. I repeat, due to one's own fault of degenerating bodhicitta and the trainings, the associated trainings. Hence, the fault is precisely that of personally degenerating bodhicitta associated with the Bodhisattva's path, namely engaging in the 6 perfections. So in his commentary to this verse, the Venerable Geshe Doga drew attention to a similar line in a similar verse in Lama Chopa, the Guru Yoga. And the verse reads in full, "We make our requests to you, O compassionate refuge protectors. With precision, you impart the good way of those gone to bliss to the unruly beings of this degenerate age, who are difficult to curb and were not tamed by the countless Buddhas of the past." So we must actually count ourselves amongst those unruly beings of this degenerate age who were not tamed in the past, because the evidence is that we're not enlightened, which is, a logic that Kabje Zopa Rinpoche often points out to us. If we need any other proof, we just look at our current situation. So Shantideva leaves no wriggle room here. In the next verse, 14, he says, "And if I continue to act like this, again and again shall I undergo suffering in unhappy realms, sickness, bondage, laceration, and the shedding of blood." Gyaltsabje, via paraphrase, points to the meaning intended here in terms of a stark warning, possibly an anticipatory rebuke, a strong admonition. He's warning us. He says, if I continue to act recklessly, I shall not become an object of their care, and I'll have to experience suffering continuously. I will have to take rebirth in the lower realms, and even if I take rebirth in happier realms, I will have sickness and lack of freedom. Either that, or I will have sickness in the lower realms and experience innumerable sufferings there, such as having my arms and legs being cut off and my body being lacerated. So Geshe Doga indicates that these are indeed confronting lines and confronting images. And he comments, this is explaining, again, we have to set the context, otherwise we're going to kind of let these topics become wobbly and out of control. We have to keep bringing them back to their context, which is, this is explaining that after having made the pledge and generated bodhicitta, if one actually gives it up and acts recklessly, then one will not become an object of the Buddha's care. Rather, one will have to experience suffering continuously. In relation, he continues, to the ripened results one will have to take rebirth in the lower realms. The environmental results are that even if I take rebirth in the happy realms, such as the human realm, I will have sickness and lack of freedom. Even when reborn in the human realm, one may experience innumerable sufferings, such as being wounded and so forth. So these are the types of sufferings that can be experienced even in a higher rebirth. So all of this vivid imagery compels us to powerfully commit to the task or the obligation, according to our promise, of practicing right now, not tomorrow or the next day or the next life even. Conscientiousness, the central theme of this chapter, therefore, must be understood as also embracing the vital importance of seizing and fully enjoying the unique benefits and endowments, the characteristics of a precious human rebirth, which we currently have. So I'm just going to move through these very quickly because they're standard material in the Lam Rim. So Gyaltsen Subje, in his commentary at this point of Shantideva's chapter, presents how, if we allow our bodhicitta to degenerate, we will become remote from the four wheels which are critical if we're to make progress in pursuing the Mahayana path. To briefly describe these four wheels, it's living in a conducive place, relying on a sublime being, making aspirational prayers, and accumulating merit. The first is to abide in a place which is conducive for the Mahayana path to be actualized. And this is presented in some of the texts as simply, profoundly simply, a place where one can accumulate virtue. So we have exactly such a place now. The second is to associate and rely on a sublime being, such as a virtuous friend, who leads one on the path to abandon negativities, faults, and to adopt virtue. Thus, the first indicates the kind of place that one should abide in, one where one generates virtue, and the second is in relation to the kind of being who one should rely upon in that space. That's why I'm quoting precious beings such as Honis Dalai Lama, or Subje, and so forth. The third is to be endowed with the results of aspirational prayers that one has previously made. I sometimes think that, particularly in a sort of Western context, the role and value of aspirational prayers can be overlooked or misunderstood. So an aspirational prayer is positing the pathway that we intend to take in the future, even if we're not capable of engaging in that action right at this moment. And in this way, we create a kind of magnetic prospect which draws us towards it in the form of spiritual growth, the unfolding of our potential. So in my own little humble, clumsy way, when I last made a visit to Sarum Monastery prior to my stem cell transplant for cancer, because that was a very perilous, medically speaking, undertaking. I didn't have much energy at all, but I did have the energy to go to India and go to Sarah J Monastery to spend some time with my teachers. And I sat in the Sarah J Gompa and read aspirational prayers, which were for my future lives as my prime spiritual activity at that time. And so people talk about closure. You have to have closure. For me, that was the most profound and significant closure, but it was the opposite of a closure, if we look at it, because it was the total opening out of my prospects going forward. And so it completely dismantled any tendency or capability I had to kind of feel, oh, woe is me, I'm going to maybe die very, very shortly, and all my dreams will come crashing down. That was completely swept away by the force of aspirational prayer. So the fourth is to be endowed with the results of previously accumulated karma or merit in particular. And this, of course, is the other side, the flip side of the coin that Shantideva was describing earlier in relation to the propulsive force of demerit. The logic here is that if we are to produce the precise causes to be in possession of the four wheels in the future, even as we're enjoying them now, we must put effort into making aspirational prayers and accumulate merit, and to relish our opportunity to rely upon a virtuous friend who instructs us how to abandon negativity and adopt virtue. And likewise, we mustn't underestimate the rarity of our current place of abode, which allows us to turn our mind to practice. So again, a very similar sentiment can be found in the Guru Puja. I quote, "By the force of this merit in all of our lives, may we never be parted from Mahayana's four spheres, and may we reach the end of our journey along the paths of renunciation, bodhicitta, the pure view, and the two stages." So you can see here this reference to Mahayana's four spheres is being articulated. This is verse 117 from the dedication. So Mahayana's four spheres are precisely what's being described here. They're spheres because we're seeking to ensconce ourselves safely within them. Not defensively, but because they provide an absolutely stable foundation for our unwavering practice. This is imperative if we are to forestall the habitual procrastinating thought that rationalizes, and I quote Gyaltsab Sabje's articulation of this rationalizing thought. He says, "I will make an effort when I attain the freedoms and endowments later on." So we shunt the task ahead of ourselves, and it gives us time off not to engage in practice now. This is the height of folly. And if we're honest with ourselves, we'll observe this customary tendency to indulge in a blithe dithering or procrastination. And such exposes what we might call a fundamental cognitive fault, which indicates or consists of the fact that we have utterly failed to recognize the pungency of our current extraordinary good fortune. So I use the word pungency here because we so easily, so apparently effortlessly, revert to the careless, lazy response of simply and so very superficially assuming that our current good fortune is simply the nature of things, a kind of natural status quo. We might even make the mistake of thinking that the universe owes us this because we're rather special, we're rather important, therefore it's the way things should be. Shantideva's next verse, therefore, seeks to further shake up this presumption which is really a manifestation of arrogance. I'm using the word deliberately. It's an arrogance predicated upon an overweening and utterly erroneous belief in impermanent causal phenomena as somehow being stable, somehow being permanent. Verse 15 reads, if the arising of the Tathagata, faith, the attainment of the human body, and my being fit to cultivate virtue are scarce, when will they be won again? So this verse is couched as a rhetorical, provocatively, rhetorical question to highlight the stakes involved in acquiring another precious human rebirth. The stakes are exceedingly high. If we fail to understand why or how this might be so, it is an indication that we've failed to identify the 5 personal endowments and the 5 circumstantial endowments that make a precious human rebirth as rare as an Udambara flower. This is a reference to a flower of a particular variety of fig under which a previous Buddha was enlightened. It sort of occurs once every 1,000 years or so. It's incredibly rare. So I'm just going to quickly gloss over this because, again, it's familiar material for the Lam Rim, but it does indicate, doesn't it, the incredible rapport, the intimate relationship that our study of this text must have with our study of the Graduated Path to Enlightenment presentation. So I'm going to be quoting from Lama Tsongkhapa's very famous middle-length Lam Rim. So I'm going to, as I said, move quite quickly, but this is from page 160 of that text. There are 8 unfree states, 4 of the human, living in a remote and savage land where the 4 types of the followers of the Buddha do not go, being stupid or dumb and having incomplete faculties or missing body parts, such as ears and so forth, holding wrong views that misconstrue past and future lives, actions and their effects, and the jewels of refuge to be non-existent. And being born where a Buddha has appeared, no Buddha has appeared, apologies, and is therefore bereft of his teachings. So we're free of all those limitations. And there are 4 non-human unfree states, those of a hell being, those of a hungry ghost, those of an animal, and those of a long-lived God. The long-lived God's an unfree state because they're immersed in bliss, worldly bliss, to such an extent that they can't see outside the envelope of their own pleasure. So there are 10 endowments, 5 pertaining to oneself, and again I'll just enumerate them. Being human, yes. Being born in a central place, yes. With unimpaired faculties, yes. Having performed no inexpiable heinous crimes, such as killing a Buddha, drawing the blood of a Bodhisattva, murdering one's parents, and so forth. And free of not having faith in the source, the 3 jewels. And there are 5 pertaining to others, sort of almost, environmentally. A Buddha has come, yes. Taught the Holy Dharma, yes. The teachings still remain, yes. The teachings are being followed, yes. There are donors and benefactors who provide monastic robes and the like. that is, and I'm just glossing Tsongkhapa here, those who are kind and compassionate and support the Dharma. Yes. So Tsongkhapa very, very deliberately, very particularly, then moves on to contemplating their great value. He says, there is nothing more critical than this contemplation, because it's going to guarantee us the motivation to practice purely and now. So finally, in his presentation, Tsongkhapa articulates the qualified mind, the nature of the qualified mind that we can expect to arise in dependence on meditating on the points of the precious human rebirth. And so these are in the form of resolves. Firstly, that we need to accomplish the Dharma, because all sentient beings only want happiness and do not want suffering. And in order to achieve this, depends solely on the Holy Dharma. Secondly, that you are able to accomplish the Dharma because you have the external condition, a spiritual teacher and a central location, and the freedoms and endowments. Thirdly, that you need to accomplish it in this very life, because if you do not accomplish it now, it will be difficult to obtain the freedoms and endowments for many lives to come. You see, this is exactly Shantideva's point in this verse. And that we need to accomplish because the time of death is uncertain. So this sequence described by Lama Tsongkhapa is deeply significant because it describes the evolutionary nature of our own unfolding recognition of our potential. And to underscore this fact, Tsongkhapa next proposes in his chapter that there are distinct advantages in contemplating the precious human rebirth, the meaning of the precious human rebirth from various points of view, from various vantages. And he subsumes this discussion under three topic headings, which again will just simply enumerate. What the nature of this life of freedoms and endowments is, how it is meaningful in terms of temporary and final goals, and how difficult it is to obtain from the point of view of cause and effect. Again, this is getting back to Shantideva's verse, isn't it? So you can actually see how these points are condensed or perfectly encapsulated in Shantideva's verse 15. Reads, if the arising of a Tathagata, faith, the attainment of a human body, and my being fit to practice virtue are scarce, when will they be won again? So these conditions we just described are not to be taken for granted whatsoever. So this third line of Shantideva's verse, and my being fit to cultivate virtue are scarce, is a reference to the need to create the prerequisite causes for a precious human rebirth, namely to cultivate pure virtues together with the supporting mediums of stainless prayer, the practice of generosity, and so forth. So now we have indeed grounds for concern for how often am I fit to cultivate virtue? This is provoked by Shantidev's verse. How often do I seek, let alone manage, to secure a firm foundation in pure ethical behavior? These are certainly points to be sincerely investigated by us. Gilp Sabje, in his commentary to this verse, says that we must deeply appreciate that to actually attain a state where one develops the two minds of bodhicitta is rarer even still than a precious human rebirth. So we must extend our analysis more deeply into an explanation or an understanding what the current advantages are. So again, we find ourselves pivoted, perhaps precariously, on this rarest, highest vantage point of having both a precious human rebirth and at least a sincere aspiration to develop the most precious mind of bodhicitta in terms of both practice and profound insight. And not to recognize it is the height of tragic folly. Hubris writ large as our unreflective ego. So Geshe Doga synthesizes what we're to take from this. He says the teaching emphasizes that our body is like something which is on loan. If we ask ourselves whether our body belongs to oneself, then yes, technically it does. However, we also recognize that we don't have any real power or ownership over it because we have to discard it. At the time of death, the consciousness moves on and we have to leave our body behind. Geshe Doga continues, the Lam Rim teachings state that if our consciousness, that since our consciousness will definitely depart from our body, only the Dharma will help at that time. This is the point to recognize, Geshe Doga says, that it is only the Dharma that will help one at the time of death when our consciousness departs the body. As only the Dharma can help us, we need to try and implement it in our everyday lives, meaning now, to the very best of our ability. And Geshe Doga summarizes, I have tried to emphasize these points to you, and of course I do this out of great concern and kindness for your well-being. Recognize that you have an opportunity to accrue virtue, even in everyday activities such as eating and drinking, by making offerings, by reminding oneself that one is eating for the sake of benefiting all sentient beings, that one is drinking for the benefit of all sentient beings, etc. And you'll recall many of us that Lama Zopa Rinpoche has emphasized these same points in his description of the Bodhisattva attitude, the way it can be described and sort of brought into the frame of our everyday life. As I exit a door, may I leave behind samsara and achieve the state of enlightenment in order to be able to turn back and embrace and benefit all suffering sentient beings. So that act of stepping through the doorway to the bathroom can become a complete bodhisattva action in this way. So Geshe Doga says, in short, whatever activity one engages in can be utilized and incorporated into one's practice so that it becomes a mean to accumulate virtue. The practice of Dharma, in short, is to engage in creating virtue. End of quote. Thus, our carefulness of mind, our conscientiousness, is to be directed precisely towards this point. Every action of our body, speech, and mind should be geared in this considerate way. Considerate not just for our own well-being, but the well-being of others. We are to infuse all of our activities with this vast outlook, while also paying close, intimate attention to how our mind is encouraging or directing us to act in a given particular situation. So Let's return to this image of our body on loan. Gyaltsab Sabje says, life does not abide even for one moment and disintegrates quickly. This body is only a one-time loan and one has no power over it. And so he's referring here to the analogy carried in verse 16, which reads, although today I'm healthy, well nourished and unafflicted, life is momentary and deceptive. The body is like an object on loan for but a minute. Tsongkhapa, in his account on the meditation on death and impermanence, quotes Ananda from the letter to kind Chandra. And he's, in that quote, it says, Lord of the earth, as long as this borrowed body stays happy without sickness and without decline, take up the essence of this very life. Become undaunted by sickness, death, and decline. One day, when faced with sickness, old age, and death, you may remember, but what can you do then? So, from that point, Tsongkhapa adds the three root contemplations, which again I'll merely gloss. The contemplation that it is certain that we will die, the contemplation that it is uncertain when we will die, and the contemplation that at the time of the death, nothing but the Dharma will be of benefit. And Tsongkhapa adds very significantly, the contemplation, he says, about the uncertainty of the time of death is the most important. So you should put effort into it. End of quote. So if we read Shantideva's verse a little closer, we can see that none of the factors of being healthy, well-nourished, and without afflictions can in any way prevent the fact that we'll die at some stage or time. We must also embrace the reality that our body is also unreliable and at some point definitely will fail us. We won't get to take that next breath or pump, that next pulse of blood. In the Lam Rim, we find this unreliability of the body discussed under a subdivision of the first main contemplation, which is the contemplation that the body is extremely vulnerable, so the time of death is uncertain. And Tsongkhapa, when he's making this point, quotes from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, if even of the ashes, if not even the ashes are left behind, when such bodies as the ground, Mount Meru, and the oceans are incinerated by the 7 blazing suns, then what need to mention extremely vulnerable humans? So Tsongkhapa glosses, he says, the body is as vulnerable as a water bubble. Therefore, any little thing, such as a thorn piercing it, may be responsible for destroying life. So I'll just mention here that in these meditations, we need to look at our own examples. And I recalled, whilst preparing the notes for this presentation, that my mother had a dear friend who died from complications incurred from slipping on a broken egg in a supermarket aisle. I think you have Walmart or something in America, same idea. She just went shopping for groceries. My mother had another friend who was crushed alive in his own home. He was a hoarder who, over the course of many years, had built up mounds of newspapers inside his house. and he used to burrow through the mounds of newspapers to get from room to room. And on one particular day, the tunnel collapsed and he was crushed. So without putting too great a spin on this story of the hoarder in the home, I thought that we can actually read it allegorically. We accumulate things in the belief that our collection is permanent and will protect us. It itself will protect us from harm and change. But in fact, it can so easily become the potent force of destruction. So to summarize what we're to take from all this, I'm going to quote the Venerable Geshe-Doga. The teaching emphasizes that our body is like something on loan. The Lamrim teaching state that since our consciousness will definitely depart from our body, only the Dharma will help at this time. This is the point to recognize. I have tried to emphasize these points to you, he says. And of course, I do it out of great concern. I quoted this verse before, this comment before, out of great concern and love for you. And then he mentioned that we had to bring it into our daily lives and right down to eating, sleeping, walking, so forth. So if you agree that I don't want to be reborn in a realm where there is more suffering, and I want to be reborn continuously in happy realms, then what you need to do, what I need to do, what we need to do, is to intentionally avoid creating negativity and proactively accumulate virtue. This is how we need to practice to create the causes for that outcome. Tsongkhapa so compellingly puts it, quote, for if the mind is biased towards the idea of not dying, what a remarkable choice of words there. If our mind is biased towards the idea of not dying, giving rise to the thought, I will not die today, then you will constantly prepare for continuing in this life and neglect preparing for future lives. Owing to this, if you are seized by the Lord of Death, in the meantime, you'll have to die in anguish. But if you prepare to die every day, you'll accomplish much that is meaningful for the future, so that even if you do not die, it is good to have done these things. And if you do die, it was all the more necessary. So you can see here the incredible role of practicing virtue conscientiously. So you can see here how Shantideva is communicating the message, a message that is not in any way bound to the kind of cultural milieu of ancient India. He's talking about us in our current situation now. It is utterly contemporary advice. It's perhaps worth mentioning before moving on that these realizations that I've been describing regarding the precious human rebirth, death and impermanence, the laws of cause and effect, etc., all pertain to a person engaged in the practices of the small or lower scope. In other words, they must be understood as foundational practices for all the other realizations of the path. Put another way, if we can't engage meaningfully in a spiritual path, I'll leave this bit out actually, so it doesn't make sense. we need to cultivate virtue as we might a tree. And in order to do that, we have to plant the seed of virtue. And this is what we've done in, as I described last year, in a uniquely potent way in the form of generating this most precious mind of bodhicitta. And so this seed is to be nurtured and cultivated so that it can spread its magnificent branches and bear its fruit. There is nothing more pressing, nothing more important. So Shantideva, in his verse 17, says, and with behaviour such as this, i.e. practicing on virtue, I shall not win a human body again, and if this human form is not attained, there will be solely evil and no virtue. In case we've somehow missed the powerful arguments pervading this chapter, Shantideva here succinctly clinches the point he's been making in the immediately preceding verses. Gyaltsabje comments, someone like myself, through actions that create negativity and no virtue, will not even obtain a human body in the next life. If I take rebirth in the lower realms without attaining a human body, I will only generate non-virtue and not the slightest amount of virtue, and it will be difficult to be reborn again in the happy realms. So the employment here in Gyaltsabje's commentary of the first person case is critical. Someone, he says, someone like myself, meaning I, me, means me. I am one of those who is prone to create only negativity and no virtue, and thus reap the consequences described. Therefore, we must understand that Shantideva here is not making some abstract point. He's cajoling us in this way and that way to face the fundamental reality of our current situation, or perhaps it's even our current predicament. Geshe-Doga suggests that not only is Shantideva calling us to take what he's saying as a personal instruction, he is also implicitly indicating that as we know ourselves best of all, there is no other person to whom we can turn to get out of this predicament. This is really, really important to take on board. So we have to jettison rescue fantasies where someone reaches over and plucks us out of our mess and hoists us into a situation where we're out of trouble, and instead turn the focus in to investigate very realistically and very deeply what are the circumstances that I currently hold. So again, the essential advantage of having at present a precious human rebirth is being emphasized. Unlike animals, and perhaps there's some who wish to debate this point, we have a unique capacity to perform such an estimation of our behavior. One of the reasons why animals, for example, find it hard to create virtue and thus again achieve a higher rebirth is that they lack an ethical structure. They might kill other animals compulsively for food over the duration of their entire lives, for example, and they are being driven impulsively, unreflectively to do this. They never deviate from this appetite, let alone consider that it might be possible to do so. We, on the other hand, are positioned to change our actions and to avoid non-virtue. So again, as Geshe-Doga says, if we are enjoying some leisure now in this realm, wouldn't it be better to be reborn in such a realm again in the future? rather than having to take a rebirth again in a state of much misery. So the fact that Geshe-Doga has posed this as a question that's still active, still open, suggests that yes, indeed, there is more work for us to do if we're to really seize the advantages, our advantages, current advantages, with both hands, as it were. Kabje Zopa Rinpoche frames the situation in a call, an invitation, an imperative to practice the Lam Rim, because he says a life devoid of practice is precisely the failure to seize our immediate current opportunities. In Rinpoche's words, anyway, life without Lam Rim is only problems, a suffering life. We're only creating problems, producing problems, continuously creating problems, living life, continuously experiencing problems. That's all it is. There is no real happiness or inner peace without the Lam Rim, without practicing the Lam Rim, without training the mind in the stages of the path to enlightenment. Even concern how to benefit others, the way to do that is by training the mind in Lam Rim, developing our mind in that. And then even concerning happiness, that's the real way to achieve happiness. So it's the essential thing in life. It is more important than money. Lam Rim is more important than money, more important than food and clothing, those daily needs. End of quote. So we're to ask ourselves, we've been provoked by Shantideva here as well, are we indeed valuing and practicing the Lam Rim, the path to enlightenment, as our chief activity? And we're also to understand, as Shantideva has laid out so clearly in the previous verses, that even the external prosperities we might experience, such as finding a good job, a well-paid job, whatever, all that has come from good karma by collecting merit. End of quote. So if we merely consume those advantages without engaging in virtuous thought and virtuous action, we're merely squandering the fruits of this virtue with not even a whiff of concern for the need to make charity by benefiting others and so forth. They're Rinpoche's examples here, in order to secure the well-being of others, let alone ourselves in the future. In short, happiness comes from Dharma, as His Holiness so vividly pictured earlier. This is a point that most certainly will not be adequately appreciated if we're not familiar with the role of karma, the reality of reincarnation for that matter. Gyaltsen Sabje's next heading indicates that we're still very much considering the implications of not conscientiously abandoning faults. And the heading reads, if reborn in the lower realms, one has no opportunity to generate virtue. And the subheading he gives for this particular verse is, if one does not strive while in the happy realms, our current situation, one will be confused in the lower realms concerning what is to be practiced and abandoned. And that was that two-way crossroads that I described earlier. So verse 18 in Shantideva's chapter reads, if, when I have a chance to live a wholesome life, my actions are not wholesome, then what shall I be able to do when confused by the misery of the lower realms? So he's laying out this scenario. The problems of doing anything coherently when overwhelmed by great suffering and miseries is obvious. We find it difficult to act skillfully when we're generating even a low-grade jealousy or anger or craving for something that we deem to be absolutely essential to possess. How much more so when immersed in pain, whether mental, physical, or both? The point is, as Geshe-Doga stresses, being completely immersed in intense suffering deprives one of the initiative to practice Dharma. Thus, if a finger is to be pointed, it has to be pointed to oneself. We need to constantly remind ourselves, and these are Geshe-Doga's words, don't lead yourself down to the lower realms, but lead yourself up to a higher rebirth. This is a sort of internal dialogue we must generate to ensure we are creating the causes for a higher rebirth. So in verse 19, Shantideva says, and if I commit no wholesome deeds there, meaning the lower realms, but readily amass much evil, then for 100 million eons, I shall not even hear the words, a happy life. Explicitly referencing this verse of Shantideva in his middle length Stages of the Path, in the section on freedoms and endowments, which we actually haven't left behind, Tsongkhapa says, most humans and other beings typically hold onto the side of the 10 non-virtues, and consequently they go to the lower realms. Furthermore, if you have to spend an eon in the hell of a Vici for each moment of anger generated towards a Bodhisattva and so on, then the bad actions accumulated over many lifetimes, which have neither come to fruition nor been overcome by antidotes and are therefore present in our own mind stream, will surely cause you to spend many eons in lower rebirths. And he continues, if you definitely purify the causes of lower rebirths accumulated previously and close the door to newly engaging in them, then the fortunate rebirths will not be hard to reach. However, this is a caveat, a big caveat, that is rarely done. If you fail to do so, you go to lower rebirths, and once you have gone to the lower rebirths, you do not create virtue, but continuously commit bad deeds, whereby, as stated in entering the Bodhisattva's way, you do not even hear the name of fortunate rebirths for many eons. You see, this is a direct gloss of the meaning of this verse of Shantideva. So again, we're being invited to focus on the nature of cause and effect. Once we find ourselves cast into the lower realms, we'll be unable to create the causes for the freedoms and the leisures. We'll be like a deep sea creature dwelling in darkness, not even aware that there is an entire universe above us filled with light. Thus, any incentive to escape will not even arise. The very notion of a happy life, a better life, will be utterly remote to us. So, I might stop the presentation there because it's quite intense material, I think you'll agree, and open up for any general discussion you might have. And what I've attempted to do here is confront, as does Shantideva, again and again, these fundamental points. He's driving the nail of wisdom as deeply as he can into our complacent, habitual, self-grasping selves, and trying to shatter the folly of the constructions that we've created out of our self-cherishing mind that's preventing us from practicing virtue. So even if we're not thinking in terms of the vast goal of the Bodhisattva here, this advice is absolutely pertinent to ensuring that we're going to maximize our opportunity to find freedom and happiness as we move forward in life. And His Holiness often says at this point of his explanations, it's actually from this point of view irrelevant whether there are future lives or not, because in the meantime, we're creating virtue that's going to ripen in a positive way. So it takes care of itself, in other words. So has anyone got any comments or observations or stories they'd like to tell in relation to the material? Oh, I think you have to turn your mic on, I think. I can't hear. You're on mute, I
Yeah,
think.
I just
Oh,
turned
there
it
we
on.
go. Wonderful. Thank you.
I don't have anything of that, but I have a question.
Yeah.
What are your top 10 purifications that I can practice? Because I'm not doing Tantra at the moment, but we just
Yeah.
learned mandala offerings in the Gompa. So I have a mandala set now. Thank you.
10's a lot.
8, 6, 2.
I'm going to give one, which is generating virtue. And
but how, besides the 6 paramitas, which are a lot, but
no, by ethical practice, not harm, as His Holiness described so beautifully earlier. He says, if we can't think of with concern for the well-being of all beings, at least act not to harm others. This is an extraordinary resolve, actually. We underestimate what that means, to decide not to harm others, not to make them unhappy at all. This is even the one next to us, the one closest to us. This is the foundation of an ethical practice that will ripen. And so Geshe-Doga indicates in his commentary on these verses that the act of creating virtue is itself, and this is to answer your question, a very good question, a very important question, is itself purification. Because we're interrupting and potentially severing the momentum of non-virtue that is grinding on and on and on. And so this is the task and the role of purification, is to give us space and enlivened opportunity to see clearly what is to be done. And of course, we can look at purification, and I'm going to, in the topic coming up, which I won't tackle today, look a little bit more at the aspects of purification, which we also looked at in relation to chapter 2, those who are present. Because it's thwarting this habitual tendency to just simply generate non-virtue. It gives us scope to think twice. So anything that we do with a mind intent on virtue can be very powerfully purificatory in this way. And it's even more so if you do it in conjunction with the 4 opponent powers, which I'll briefly introduce again next month. So I hope that answers your question. You know, we can get very technical here and say that these sorts of things we have to purify in this particular way, and these sorts of things we have to purify in this particular way. All that's very, very important and very valuable. But if we can't control our own mind state, then these things are mute. They're wonderful to hear about. They're wonderful to even do technically. But if we're not actually trying to change our mind, then they're not having that power at all. It's Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. I was thinking more about Chosang's question and your response, and also thinking back to saying something, and I think it's the quotation from His Holiness about even just refraining from harming others and trying to do benefit to others, even if you're not a spiritual person, is an incredible thing.
Yeah.
Those are all coming together.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, to add to that, though, is there an element of dedicating as well to somehow, control or manage the way that virtue comes to fruition?
There are a number of aspects to that question, of course, but I think in terms of the four opponent powers in particular, which are obviously very pertinent in this context, the power of the promise is fulfilling that role. So not only do I not wish to perform that action again, I promise not to perform that action again. At least, and I'm going to mention this next week, at least for an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year. We have to be realistic here. And then we rejoice when we have discovered that, yes, indeed, we haven't engaged in killing, for example. So there's a kind of an active promise being made there, which is sealing, so a magical seal, the virtue that we've created, and it's protecting it karmically from being lost or damaged in the future through dedication effectively. So I think talk about dedication and talk about the promise, I think those two are riding very, very closely together, because in the dedication, we're making a promise to fulfill the energies of what's been accumulated in particular ways. So yes, it's very important to steer our virtue projectively ahead in this way. So that's why I often give the example of giving a mouthful of food to an animal. And one description of that act is that we get a lump of food and we give it to the animal, and the animal eats it and is happy. That's a virtuous act, without question. But we can accompany that act, that same apparent act, with a mind that thinks simultaneously with the act, and through giving to this one precious sentient being, may I be able to nourish and fulfill the needs of all sentient beings in the future. So it becomes a kind of platform for a dedication which will seal that karma to ripen in that way. So it becomes a protection of the karma. And there's nothing more precious, more powerful than that. And that's why Kabje Zoba Rinpoche so famously has dedication sessions that sometimes go for a longer period of time than the amount of time that he has spent expounding on a particular topic or a verse, because it's a way of sealing that virtue, and so that it can ripen. Not the seed won't be damaged or scorched by a mind of anger, for example, or lost. So do you want to add to that, Stephen? Because it's it's a big topic, isn't it, potentially?
Yeah, definitely. No, that was really quite interesting the way you handled that, Dr. Ross. And also, I'd never really made that direct connection between the promise being either a platform or even in itself a dedication. For example, yeah, and may I not commit this, non-virtuous action again. I'd be supported by the conditions and the ripening of karma so that I won't do this again. So to me, that's very clearly a dedication.
And if you think about it, what's happened there, this is a bit like the judo flip to the ankle by a martial arts expert of a giant adversary. We've utilized with incredible poignancy and skill a moment of the arising of an affliction and flipped it over itself to create a vast mind wishing the opposite of that in the form of virtue. May I never commit this action again. And this promise is a vow, equivalent to a vow, and that resides in the mind stream, in itself accrues virtue going forward. It strengthens that seed, flourishes in our mind.
And so say it's a form, in fact.
Yes, technically, yeah. So it's really very encouraging, I think, isn't it, to look at these things in such detail, because it gives us incredible hope. It means even if we have a bad day, which we do, all is not lost if we're careful. This is what conscientiousness means. It's going to acknowledge that, yes, we stuff up, we get into trouble, but if we manage things as carefully as we can, we'll actually be able to make definite progress. Even, as His Holiness indicates, it's very slow. Now, His Holiness says at the end, if you want to know if your spiritual practice has been effective or not, don't look at how you've sort of performed for the rest of the day. Look back on your life and see whether you're an improved person, a kinder person, a better person. And because we've committed ourselves to the Bodhisattva vehicle, we have allowed ourselves the scope and momentum to continue to grow in the future through multiple lifetimes. And I often reflect on this because it's not meant to take the urgency out of our immediate practice, but it's incredibly inspiring to think about that, because it gives us enormous commitment to our promise, because it's going to ripen across multiple lifetimes, providing we don't forfeit it. So Shantideva is saying, whatever you do, don't let that seed get burnt or damaged or lost. Are there any other reflections, or you might have an example from your own lives or story to share? I think, of course, Tonglen's the perfect example of that sort of transformational technique, isn't it? So I'm generating a mind of anger. Not a good idea, but nonetheless I am. And then, because I've practiced in the past, I've rehearsed, I've developed some momentum in thinking that the mind of anger is a faulty mind. I then have the scope to recognize it as it arises by confronting its presence. I'm not hiding, I'm not submerging it. And then I make the wish to take on the anger, for example, of all other beings, so that they don't have to reap the karmic consequences. And I direct that taking onto the spot of my own mind generation of anger. And when the two strike each other, as we know from the technique, they pulverize and obliterate themselves, leaving a radiant spaciousness, out of which we then generate a beautiful, radiant mind of non-anger, which then reaches out to all sentient beings. So again, the base of that scenario has been a mind generation of anger. But because we've become, at least to some extent, adept in these incredible spiritual transformative techniques, we have the opportunity of utilizing it into the path. And so this is what thought transformation means, what Lojong means. If it's a positive situation, we send out that positive situation to all sentient beings without exception from our heart. And then we can take on all the conditions that might thwart them from experiencing that wonderful state at the same time, and destroy our self-cherishing attitude, which is stopping us from our spiritual evolution, preventing us from helping them in more dynamic and direct ways. And so no matter what's occurring, we can work with the situation. So I think this is what obviously Kabje Rinpoche is talking about when he's talking about developing the Bodhisattva attitude. It's not an attitude such as something we carry around in a suitcase. It's an actual mode of being that's being talked about here, how we work with the circumstances that are unfolding. So I think we might maybe spend a few moments in quiet meditation, just reflective meditation, and then I'll ask Blue to kindly read the dedications for us. Thank you. So in this meditation, reflect on the topic or topics that have been raised today through these incredibly powerful verses. And in our own way, see if we can resolve to practice according to the Bodhisattva motivation with great purity, great intensity, great clarity, not letting anything come in its way. So we're going to navigate whatever circumstance arises, both in this and future lifetimes, and transform all of the unfolding circumstances that we encounter into the path to enlightenment. And the reason for this is that we can't leave our suffering mothers suffering for even one more moment. Thank you very much. And I'll ask Lou to lead the prayers, dedication prayer. Thank you. I'm not hearing you, Lou. I'm not sure what's happening.
For as long as space endures,
Oh, there we
and for
go.
as long,
Thank you.
and for as long as living beings remain, and to lend me I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. May all the pains of living creatures ripen solely upon myself. And through the might of the Bodhisattva Sangha, may all beings experience happiness. May the teachings without the sole medicine for suffering and the origin of every joy be maturely supported and honored and abide for a very long time. I prostrate to Manjughosha, through whose kindness wholesome minds ensue, and I prostrate to my spiritual masters, through whose kindness I develop. Dedication prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha, lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen never diminish, but increase more and more. May my venerable Lama's light be firm, his white divine action spread in the 10 directions, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. Long life prayers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish granting of this fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. In a land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until psychic existence is ended. A prayer for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Peerless teacher and assembly of children of victorious ones, Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, together with your lineage, all the offers of refuge of the infinite lands, please now bestow the virtue and goodness to accomplish this prayer. In holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. Sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, while striving exclusively for the welfare of the victorious one's teachings and mother living beings who suddenly departed to peace. At this I lost hope. Nevertheless, to the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of three jewels, the great waves of the mind generation of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a new reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. A lamenting wail, a supplication for the swift return of the Supreme Lord of Refuge, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Lama Kien, Lama Kien, Lama Kien, Drinchen Sawe Lama Kenyo. Guru, think of me. Guru, consider me. Gracious Guru, care for me. Root Guru, most gracious and kind, do not deprive us of your compassionate refuge. Listen and consider this health-filled prayer made by our tormented disciple. Guru, you embody the blessings of the Buddhas of the three times. You may rest in great bliss, equiposed with the dhatu of unimpeded luminosity, yet the playful dancing of your loving compassion can emanate in myriad ways. So swift appearance of magical wisdom, the Rupakaya. The time has come for you to call for us once again with your affectionate compassion. I invoke you, I call upon you, I implore you on behalf of all beings. Arise, arise, arise from the Dhammakaya. Do not rest in Kakara or other pure celestial realms. Rather, to benefit the Buddha's teachings and all living beings, swiftly return to the southern continent to spread the Buddha Dharma of study and realization. Quickly return to guide us poor wretched beings, such as the desperate cry of us, your disciples. Return so that we may actually behold your presence and receive the blessings of your enlightened body, speech, and mind. All violations, errors, mistakes, and broken samaya that we have made in relation to your spontaneously present awakened body, speech, mind, and activity, through our being baffled, confused, and conceiving things in erroneous ways, we confess within the luminous emptiness of your three kayas, of everything auspicious, the supreme auspiciousness, may they be the auspiciousnesses of emptiness and compassion, conjoined in the auspiciousnesses of a timely meeting between master and disciples. To the force of the truth of unchanging suchness, may the unmistaken incarnation return quickly. This lament was made by me, a Dakini with pure faith in Samaya, her eyes filled with tears of sorrow. May these wishes of a beggar woman be fulfilled, to the blessings of the deity of the three roots. Perception, its object, and the act of perceiving, all dissolve within the expanse, the blissful character of suchness. Tenzin Osalhita, venerable one, to use kindness succeeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West. Mindfully of loving concern for us, and intentionally descending again to a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Geshe Lobsang Doga, you with an immutable vow to spread to the limits of space the Dharma of the able one in general, and the Dharma of the pure-minded conqueror, supreme, superior spiritual friend of unrepayable kindness, please remain for hundreds of eons and bestow the supreme and common siddhis. Geshe Tupten Sherab, beloved teacher, leading your students toward wisdom and compassion, explain to exacting discernment the steps of the graduated path. You are the unequaled guide. Please live a long and stable life. Multiplying mantras. Chum dan da de jen shake padra chumpayang. Dagpa zogpe sange numpa nangze u ki gilpo lashak shelo Jiangchu, Senpai, Senpai, Chenpo, Kuntu, Zangpo, Lashak, Shelo, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Du, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Du, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Du, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Du, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Duru, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Duru, Jayamukhi Soha, Tayata Panchagriya, Arobodani Soha, Om Duru Duru, Jayamukhi Soha. Due to the power of the blessings of the eminent Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the power of infallible dependent arising, the power of my pure special attitude, may all my pure prayers succeed immediately.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all, and been a delight to see old faces again. So it's lovely.